it's an interesting thing that back in the 1990s, in that romantic and positive time in the past, distant past, there were those of us who thought it was going to be possible to build sort of inside-outside political movements that embraced protest and also did smart electoral politics. And there were all these young kids who kind of came in and dreamed that dream. And now they've all ended up as, thuggish labor bosses across this country. And this is just another of them. But thank you so much for that kind introduction. I appreciate it very much. And I actually think it's sort of a compliment to refer to SEIU as thuggish. It just doesn't really fit the image, does it? But it's a wonderful union. Yes, SEIU is a wonderful union doing incredible work and was so central to the Wisconsin struggle so far and as it goes forward. So another round of applause for this lovely and good, kind words. I'm so glad to be in Seattle. I spent when you put a book out, and this book came out, it just published about a week ago. What you do is this kind of weird round of interviews. And so there's constant radio interviews. I do Ed Schultz's show, pretty much the radio show every day, and television, relatively often. But then in this selling a book period, you're just kind of constantly doing interviews. But there's this odd dynamic that so many of the interviews are East Coast. And so by like 10 in the morning, I've done my whole day of stuff. And so I got to walk around Seattle today, and it was such a lovely day to do it. I especially enjoyed sort of the frigid, spewing rain, but it was very encouraging and sort of a very warm and positive walk around, because I was here in the fall of 1999 for the WTO protests, and I walked the route. I came down and literally sort of walked through the downtown by the convention center. And it looks different without the tear gas, but still the memories were rich and fond. And I walked up. I actually saw I went by the place where all the direct action was run out of, which is now a coffee roasters, I think, and walked across. So it was a really good, for me at least, because I thought 1999 was a very formative moment politically for me, and I think for an awfully lot of people. And I thought back as I was walking, and I do write about this in the book, how many parts of the Wisconsin protest of last year, these mass protests that drew as many as 150,000 people out to the center of a great city and then occupying a state capitol, not for 1 day or 2 days, but for the better part of 3 weeks to protest against an assault on labor rights. This was sort of an instantaneous movement. It came from the grassroots, and people didn't have a lot of reference points. And so many of the slogans and the tactics and the ideas went back to Seattle, 1999. And as I was walking around, I was thinking, yeah, this is what democracy looks like. Big slogan of the Wisconsin protest. First heard it on the streets of Seattle. The idea of this mass of people kind of going in to the center of an activity and protesting, not just one day, but day after day after day. Again, something you saw in Seattle. And so I did it, what of course now is, the journalist's great, thoughtful essay approach. I tweeted, that my 140 characters that say it's very wonderful to be in Seattle, a place that is so much a root of what we're seeing across this country now, in capitals such as Madison and Columbus, Ohio, Indianapolis, Lansing, Michigan, where people are pushing back against this austerity agenda, and also with the Occupy Wall Street movement. These are not all the same thing. They come from different places and different streams. But if you look back at a core reference point, it was Seattle in 1999. And this city remains really a great reference point for most of what we see in a progressive politics that doesn't just do elections, that recognizes that if you're really serious about democracy, democracy has to occur every day. So let me tell you a little bit about Wisconsin. And this is like the oddest thing imaginable, because this book is very much positioned as a Wisconsin book. But in fact, it's really a book about the American response to a global austerity agenda that is proposing to balance all of the books on the backs of working people. And this global austerity agenda, which has gotten the Greeks very upset, it's in play all over. And the kind of starting point for understanding what happened in Wisconsin is that what you really have in America, as well as much of the world, is a debate between austerity and accountability. Austerity says the cookie jar is empty. Everybody's got to starve, right? And if you, except for the guy squeaking the door, he doesn't have to starve because he knows where the other cookies are. But the cookie jar is empty, so everybody's got to starve because there's no cookies left. Accountability says we would like to know who took the cookies out of the jar, and maybe we could get them to give us some of them back so that everybody doesn't have to starve. And the challenge with the austerity agenda is that by and large, as it's covered in our media, and it is addressed by our political class, it leaves us with kind of no alternative. And it goes back to the great Margaret Thatcher line when she was breaking the miners' unions back in the 1980s, where she said, that the response to everything was, Tina, there is no alternative. We have to do this. This is the only way to do it. And if you think back to January and early February of 2011, immediately after the Republican wave election of 2010, that was basically where everybody was. Everybody was sort of like, there is nothing we can do to push back against cuts and cuts and cuts. Barack Obama, the Democratic president of the United States, in December of 2010, accepted the extension of the Bush-era tax cuts and an expansion of the estate tax exemption because billionaires weren't rich enough. And you're thinking, well, but I thought the Democratic president was not supposed to do that. And then you realize that in late 2010, early 2011, we had a situation where, while there were certainly ordinary folks all over this country saying, I don't think that's the right way to go. I think maybe we could even tax the rich. There was basically no broad discussion about how we might push back. In fact, we were sort of like protest tourists in America. We got our high from watching Egyptians go to their square and protest against totalitarian, authoritarian economic injustice, and we thought, isn't that cool? Like, isn't Egypt such a great place because they go to their square? And from January into early February of 2010, we all sat at home and watched the television as people protested. And the Egyptian protests, I want to emphasize, had very, very little to do with Mubarak being a totalitarian dictator. Happened that he was, and very well supported by U.S. tax dollars for a very long time. But what really had happened was that you had a situation where the economy in Egypt had gone off the rails, and people were objecting to an economic austerity agenda coming down on them, and that objection really keep people coming to the square. So Americans watched it with great interest for week after week after week. We even put up with Anderson Cooper, the tight T-shirt. There's one night where he was reading a poem, like sort of this tone poem about the Egyptians, and I thought to myself, haven't these people suffered enough? Haven't we suffered enough? And yet we watched it with great interest. Finally, in mid-February, Hosni Mubarak had had enough of Anderson Cooper and the protests, and he stepped down. And that was the end. That was the end of that. We could flip the cameras off and not pay attention to Egypt anymore. But there's an interesting thing that happened. The morning after Hosni Mubarak stepped down in Egypt, Scott Walker, the recently elected Republican governor of Wisconsin, looked around the world and he determined that the planet was one dictator short. And he thought perhaps he could fill the void. Now, he didn't say this officially. This is just a presumption on the part of many Wisconsinites. And so he did exactly what authoritarian players do when they want to really seize control. They don't, it's not the old days where Egypt had elections, always had elections. It's that you make your opponents structurally so weak that they cannot challenge you. And so Scott Walker announced on February 11th, 2011, that they were going to use a budget repair bill. Right? This is wasn't that he didn't like unions, understand? The budget was an imbalance, and so they had to repair it. And usually budget repair bills used to be like a movement of a zero on a ledger. It was a very minor thing. This time it was 111 pages. And the 111 pages, produced in large part by the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, which is a group funded by our friends, the Koch brothers, who, by the way, ALEC is doing bills right here in Washington State if you need any. Usually they're smart enough to take the cover page off. Although we found in the research for the book, I found that there's a number of places around the country where legislators have actually taken an ALEC bill. This is a very right-wing group, by the way. ALEC, corporate-funded group that puts corporate lobbyists together with legislators and then produces legislation. Sometimes they forget to take the cover page off, which is really embarrassing. But in Wisconsin, they took the cover page off and did this 111-page bill. And it took away collective bargaining rights for public employee unions. It took away dues checkoff for public employee unions so they couldn't be funded. And it actually forced public employee unions to cease to exist at the end of every year. They had to go out of existence, and then they could reconstitute themselves if they wanted to put all the effort into reorganizing. Now, many people say, well, that's just how it must be now in the new world. Except I always suggest to folks, well, what if we sort of flipped that over and looked at the corporate side and said that at the end of every year, corporations cease to exist and must reconstitute themselves? A relatively popular idea in Seattle, but you understand what that would be. On December 31st, at a certain point, you'd go around and lock all the McDonald's. And then you would say to McDonald's, and they'd say, well, give us the keys so we can open up on January. You'd say, no, you don't exist anymore. You have to start from scratch. That place you had all set up, that's not yours anymore. You have to start from scratch and completely reconstitute the entire McDonald's chain starting on January 1. Well, call me crazy. I think they would object. And the weird thing was that on the workers' side, on the union side, there was a presumption that people wouldn't object. This is the incredible thing. Scott Walker had a memo where he said that, we're going to do this in Wisconsin. Of course, he said that we will be the sort of canary in the coal mine. We will show the rest of the country how to do it. The ideas that we do here will spread across the United States. He said, this is going to be a breeze. We will pass this bill in a week and have, completely gut out the unions in very, very short order. Well, most of the Democratic leaders in the legislature, when I talked to them in the days afterward, thought that would be the case as well. It wasn't that they wanted the unions to go away. They just thought, well, unions, they're small now. They're not, this isn't 1930s. They don't have the muscle that they used to have. And people don't like unions anymore. Everybody hates teachers. And, except the people who hate nurses more. And I think we can all agree we don't like snowplow drivers to come down our road in the winter and clear it. And so, there's just a broad despisal of unions, of course. And so there was this assumption on a part of an awfully lot of political strategists, political players, that Walker would get his way. And this was also true, amazingly enough, in a lot of the leadership of unions. It wasn't that they didn't want to fight back. It was that they were very passionate to fight back, but they really weren't imagining that it would be possible, or at least that they would achieve quite what occurred. There was just a sense that unions had been beaten down for too long, forced to compromise, forced to give up concessions, forced to accept a degeneration of the process. And this was so broadly accepted among the leadership that I actually, in my first interviews, was starting to think, I wonder if there's going to be any kind of pushback. And someone, however, forgot to send the memo to the students at the University of Wisconsin. And so the morning after Governor Walker came down with his plan. 50 students gathered in front of the University of Wisconsin Memorial Union with signs that said, "This will not pass. We're going to stop this bill." And they sent out emails. They knew how to use this Twitter thing and the Facebook and all that. And they said, this is a fundamental challenge. If we want to have a future, if we want to live in a country where our work, our study results in some kind of reasonable recompense for the work that we put in, if we want to be paid to work in the public sector, not become millionaires, but at least become, have a decent life, we got to fight now, or there's not going to be another place to fight. That message resonated to such an extent that on the Monday after Scott Walker came down with his plan, 1,000 students, mostly graduate students, members of the Teaching Assistants Association, which is the oldest graduate student association in the world, marched from the university to the Capitol. 1,000 strong. Now that looked like a lot. Of course, we've become kind of protest, we have high demands now, but in those days, 1,000 looked like a lot. And they were very, very sweet. They had cut out little hearts because it was Valentine's Day. And they went to the Capitol with the hearts and they said, "Governor Walker, don't break our hearts. Don't destroy our unions. Don't cut our pay, our benefits, and things of that nature." By the way, the governor's plan also made public employees pay for their pensions, much more for their pensions, made them pay much more for their benefits, and it capped their wages. So a lot of pretty hard, real reality for graduate students especially. So after they had their protest at the Capitol, historically, in recent years, you would have the protest and then you would leave and go home and wait to see yourself on television. And I'm being honest with you. My comrade here will tell you, yeah, I know that has happened. But these students, they didn't get that memo either. They stayed. And some of them went into the Capitol and never really left for 3 weeks. And that afternoon, the teachers' unions had called a rally. And this was the first point at which I thought something odd was happening in Wisconsin. Because I picked my daughter up after school. She's in first grade. And I said, I'm going to take you to Noodles because children only eat at Noodles. And I understand that. So I'm going to take you to Noodles, but I have to stop at a rally at the Capitol. And my daughter, who has grown up with me and her mother, is so familiar with rallies at the Capitol or political events that she wasn't bothered by that. She's like, "That's cool. Okay, 15 minutes at a rally and then we're off to Noodles." And so we get to the Capitol, but this isn't like other rallies. There's 8,000 people out there. And I thought to myself, this is interesting what's going on here. And I went up, they'd been asked to speak, and so I go up to the podium, and I'm trying to figure out why so many people are out. And I've always said Wisconsin is a progressive state, much like Washington, great, rich, progressive history, much like Oregon. There's a handful of these states where, there is something in the water. There's something a little better there. And I was thinking, well, maybe it just surfaced. Maybe something good's going on. But I got my cue pretty quickly from a guy who was standing behind the stage, and he had a sign in Arabic. And I walked over to him. I covered the Intifada. I've covered, wars in the Middle East, the first Persian Gulf War. I've spent a good deal of time in that part of the world. So I'm feeling kind of proud of myself. I walk up and I go, "Assalamu alaikum." And he goes, "I don't speak Arabic." And I'm like, "You can understand my confusion, the sign." And he goes, "Oh, that. I went online today and I found that translator thing and I figured out how to write, 'If Egypt can get rid of Mubarak, we can get rid of Walker.'" So I'm thinking, there may be something here that doesn't quite fit into the traditional calculus of how you organize a movement. Maybe these people watched the television for 18 days and it got in their head that if something bad happens, you go to the square and you protest for 18 days. And then the bad guy steps down and all, And in fact, I kept hearing people say, I said, "How long are you going to be out here?" After, it'd been like a weekend. "How long are you going to be out here?" And they said, 18 days. And I'm thinking, all right. But I wasn't quite sure until about a week later. Each day the protests grew. First there was 1,000, then 8,000, then 15,000, then 25,000. By Friday night, there was 50,000 people standing in the snow in front of the Capitol. And by that Saturday, the next day, it was close to 100,000. Massive increases, constant growth in the number of people that were out. During that process, people, when you have that many people out, you don't really know how to protest, right? You're not sure, because usually you go to a rally, you're at a march or something like that, and then it's done. But when you're out there all day, every day, you just sort of walk around the Capitol a lot. They started closing down streets. First the core streets around, then the streets coming in. So pretty much the downtown was closed. And there were thousands of people marching around. One day Jesse Jackson came in, went up to the Capitol, he got out, and, he didn't know where he was going. Nobody knew where he was going. He just started walking around. There's like 7,000-8,000 people following him. And he would stop, they would stop. But one day as we're walking around the Capitol, there's this guy with a sign. And you know when a movement is genuine. A movement is not genuine when it has a printed sign from the printer. It may be genuine, it may be real, it may be sincere. But if it's a printed sign from the printer, somebody went and produced all that. Even if it's like a sign you got, one of those poster boards you get from Kinko's, right, where you get out your marker and you write something like that, that's cool, but it's, something missing there. A movement is really genuine when the sign is a torn apart box that somebody has written with a pen where they keep going. It's not a Sharpie, it's a regular ballpoint pen, and they keep going over it again and again till they make the letters. And so there's this guy walking around on one of the snowiest, coldest days, and he has this big, torn up box, and it says, "I thought Cairo would be warmer." People really got something here. They made a connection that, we always talk about international solidarity. There really was international solidarity. Only it wasn't the way that Americans usually think about it, that we have a great idea and everybody else does what we tell them to do. No, it was somebody else had a great idea. We got in trouble and we said, we're going to borrow their idea and bring it here. And it worked so well. And there was such an incredible joy to this process that I remember as I was walking around, even in the first few days, and we didn't have a lot of media coverage of what was going on. Ed Schultz did terrific coverage from the very first day. Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! Did terrific coverage from the very first day. Local independent media and grassroots media, Laura Flanders from Grit TV, a handful of people really did the job. But by and large, there wasn't a lot of national media coverage because the national media absolutely could not understand what was going on here. That masses of people were actually coming out and they were staying out, that they had peacefully occupied the capital of an American state. And when I'm talking, I want to emphasize to you, the occupation that occurred will blow your mind. It wasn't just, like 50 people sitting down, in the middle of it. Every step in the Capitol, steps in the Capitol, and this is a big old marble building, steps became premium space because it was flat and there were so many people sleeping in the Capitol, sometimes at night, 2,000 and 3,000 people sleeping in the Capitol. Well, the governor was beside himself. It wasn't supposed to work this way. And the reason it worked, the reason that what happened in Wisconsin worked, and this is, the book that I've written is a story of much of what happened in Wisconsin, but it's really an examination of how you do a new politics of protest. What works, where we do things that allow us to push back in ways that we perhaps thought were impossible. And the first thing that worked in Wisconsin, and this is the critical thing for making all of these other elements come together, is the Democrats in Wisconsin weren't great. And I will tell you that the Democratic state senators in Wisconsin will tell you they weren't great. A lot of them are just, politicians as predictable as ever. And, there's some liberals, there's some progressives, there's some labor guys, but there are also some folks who were really pretty weak, sort of soft, not quite Joe Lieberman, but, I think we all can identify the Democrats who we're not quite sure are going to come through for you. And there were quite a few of them. And the interesting thing is that the leader of the Democratic caucus in the state legislature was a guy named Mark Miller. And if you meet this guy, he fits his image. He's a former military pilot, but in his early 60s, he's like ramrod, straight up guy. Just happens that he's a radical. And Mark Miller was so horrified by what was going on that he had his aides go through all the rules. And this is another first lesson, right? Go through all the rules. Learn the rules better than the bad guys. And so he had him go through all the rules. And finally one morning he goes, about 4 days in with all these crowds coming, he says, "What's this fiscal quorum thing?" And an aide checked it out and it said, well, if you're passing a budget bill, you have to have like 2/3 of the people there. Now, Democrats had been wiped out in the last election. They did not have the power to do anything except it happened that there were 14 of them. And that was exactly the number that you needed, that the Republican leadership needed to have to move the budget forward. So if all 14 Democrats in the Wisconsin state legislature walked out, the bill couldn't move forward. And so on that first Thursday morning of the fight, as there were tens of thousands of people outside, Mark Miller called his caucus into a room, and he said to him, look, no aides, nobody can come in. He had not given them any warning. He said, he pulled the curtain over, and he said, I want you to look outside. There are tens of thousands of Wisconsinites who have come here to say this is wrong. There are Republicans out there who are saying Scott Walker did not tell us he was going to launch this anti-labor agenda. This is part of a national anti-labor agenda. If we do not draw the line here, it will be Wisconsin, and then it will be Ohio, and then it will be Michigan, and all across this country. We have got to do something. That's why we're Democrats. And if we all leave the Capitol and leave the state today, if we go out of this state, because by law, if you're in the state, you can be arrested and taken to the Capitol as a legislature and forced to be part of the process. If we do that, we can stop this process. And he said, and I've got the vans waiting outside. Is everybody in? And amazingly enough, all 14 state senators suddenly became Democrats. And they're like, okay, not everybody was enthusiastic. One of the guys is 83 years old. Right? I mean, so no toothbrushes, nothing. They get in the vans, they wheel out of the Capitol, and they don't stop till they get to Illinois. The largest sacrifice that any Wisconsinite could ever make. And 3 weeks in Illinois. And at the La Quinta Inn in the parking lot of Great America. Because Mark Miller, the leader of the Wisconsin State Senate, is this ramrod straight guy who said, you can't even use your campaign funds for this because then it will look like you're being paid by the unions or by, your allies to do this. You have to do this out of your own pocket. And there's one legislator, he should go unnamed, but he's been through had some marital problems, stuff like that. He drives the delivery van for one of the hotels to the airport. I mean, these are not wealthy people. And Mark Miller's saying, I'm sorry, guys and gals, we're down here. One of the women is 7 months pregnant. And he says, we're going to Illinois and we're staying until we stop this thing. Well, it was an amazing thing because they did. And they actually recognized that sometimes politicians have to follow people, not people follow politicians. It's an incredibly revolutionary concept. And so they stayed down in Illinois, and what that did, that created that space, those weeks of space in which a movement could build. Because as long as the senators weren't there, the bill did not move forward. And so each day, more and more people came to the Capitol. Now, finally, you started to see these pictures, and I think most of you probably saw them, incredible images of inside the Capitol, shot from the top of the dome, where you look down and you say, what is that kind of mass of colors down there? And then you realize it's people's heads. It's all the different hair colors. And then you saw these amazing shots from outside where every street is filled, every blade of grass covered. And suddenly the national media decided, well, maybe there is a little bit of a story in Wisconsin. We'll go out and cover that. Now, of course, Fox did, its usual brilliant job. Bill O'Reilly one night says, labor violence has broken out in Wisconsin. With all due respect, we're Wisconsinites. It's the most peaceful people you'll ever meet. Side story, a very tough union leader from New Jersey drove out, wanted to see this, kind of the most massive labor demonstration since the 1930s, this incredible moment. So she comes out, she arrives and she goes to the Capitol. It's a point at which people have been locked out of the Capitol and they're chanting, "Let us in, let us in." And they're chanting something else. And this tough labor leader from New Jersey, she was a nurses leader, I will tell you. And she goes, "What are they saying? I can hear them saying, 'let us in,' but what's that other word they're saying?" And the person next to her said, "Please." Woman said she had never actually heard that word at a labor rally before. And so these incredible moments, and the media comes out to watch this. And amazingly enough, the Fox violence thing you expect, right? And so Bill O'Reilly's covering it, saying it's turned very, very violent. And then the camera shot pulls away and there's palm trees. And amazing, I don't know if you know this, but the palm tree is not native to Wisconsin. And so creatively, one of the unions went out and they went to some party store and they brought every blow up palm tree in Wisconsin. So from there on out, you'd have these thousands and thousands of people waving palm trees at rallies, which caused Michael Moore to just bust a gut. But so you had these incredible, moments and amazing stuff. Badly covered by the people you'd expect to badly cover it, but actually in some ways worse covered by the people you'd expect to do better. And the most amazing story, and a chapter in the book where I spent a lot of time looking at how media covers protests, not just in Wisconsin, but really coming all the way up through Occupy and all the different ways in which media really blows the story. And the classic one is the New York Times came out. The New York Times, of course, the great newspaper of record of America. So the New York Times reporters arrive, and they cover the Times, and this is not to pick on the Times, because I think the Times, Washington Post, all the major media outlets in America tend to do things pretty much the same way. They think everything important in America happens either in about 20 blocks of Manhattan or about 8 blocks of Washington, D.C. And beyond that, it's sort of pretty much covered, the rest of the country's covered pretty much the same way they cover Africa. There's a map, it's a little complicated, do we have to learn all the capitals? All right. And so when the story breaks out, there's some sort of trouble in America. And generally trouble in America is when somebody who isn't rich gets in the way of somebody who is rich. And that had happened in Wisconsin because, of course, remember back in February of 2010, we were all being told that, it's austerity all the time. And, Paul Ryan's going to take Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And even a lot of Democrats are saying, well, it's the rational way to do it. Sorry, old people. And so there was this sense that something really weird was going on out in the middle of the country. And so the New York Times scrambled their reportorial units. They were given, they got their flak jackets on, and they got their, topographical maps and their phrase books, and they parachuted into Wisconsin, hoping perhaps to sample the native cheeses. And so they get to the Capitol in Madison. And if I could make this up, I couldn't make up as good a story as this. So they get to the Capitol in Madison. There's 100,000 people out, 120,000, there's huge crowds of people. And they decide, that's not the story. Because, obviously, mass protests in America is not the story. Mass protests in Egypt is the story, but not in America. As Laura Flanders, my friend, said, the funny thing about Egypt was that each day, as the crowds grew, the publicity or the attention from the media grew. In Wisconsin, as the crowds grew, the attention receded. And, but, so the New York Times reporters get there and they say, this can't be the story. There's gotta be a lot of people out there who don't agree with what's going on here, right? There's gotta be private sector workers who don't like public sector workers, because we know that everybody hates teachers and nurses and snowplow drivers and that. And so, we just have to go find them. So the New York Times hightails it out of Madison and goes 40 miles south to a town called Janesville, Wisconsin. And they arrive in Janesville looking for the mythical private sector worker who doesn't like public sector employees. And of course they go to a tavern. And in the tavern, they find a guy midday. And they walk up to him and, open up the phrase book. And, hello, worker. And you are upset because public workers come across the lake in their yachts to pick up their checks, right? For working 4 hours a week. and they have huge pensions and you don't have one and you must be very jealous of them. And the guy goes, yes, I am. I am so jealous of them. He says, I'm a laid-off factory worker from the General Motors plant that closed down, and I'm UAW, and I like unions, but the public sector unions are just, they're just taking too much. They're demanding too much. It's coming out of my pocket. We got to do something about it. Governor Walker is right. Well, the New York Times had its story. They raced back to their computers, sent it off, and on the front page of the New York Times, a couple days later, was a story that said, private sector workers in Wisconsin do not approve of their public sector colleagues. They object. And you had this whole story, and you read it, and I'm reading the story, and I admit right up front in the book, I got a little bit of bias. And I'm thinking, darn, I thought something real was going on here. I thought we were starting to see solidarity, in ways that we hadn't seen for a long time. The governor exempted the firefighters and the police, and yet the firefighters and police were, decided to throw their exemption aside and join the protest. It was an amazing, I thought private sector too. But no, I was wrong. Because the New York Times said on their front page that there was this division and union members don't support union members. And I was pretty sad about it until about a couple days later when I was reading, on page 2 of the New York Times, down by the hemorrhoid ads. Not on the front page. The correction that said about that story on the front page about the private sector worker that didn't like the public sector worker. Turns out that he didn't work at the General Motors plant that closed down. And he didn't work at any of the other industrial plants that we finally got around to checking at in the Janesville area. And then we finally did call the UAW, and they had no record of him ever having been a member of the UAW. And it kind of looks like he might have been a Republican operative and so we just sort of got everything wrong. All right? And you think, well, that's, people, I get things wrong. We all get things wrong. That happens. But the unfortunate thing about getting stories about workers' struggles wrong at critical moments is it reinforces power's desire to maintain the fantasy that nobody likes the workers, that nobody likes the unions, that the unions are always wrong. And so, parallel to all this stuff, I don't know how closely you all followed the Wisconsin struggle, but one of the best parts of the story was a blogger from Buffalo, New York, a guy named Ian Murphy, known as the Buffalo Beast, who likes to call people and punk them, right? He calls famous people, gets them on the phone, and pretends to be somebody and talks them through some crazy thing. So the Buffalo Beast, Ian Murphy, who I one of the stars of the book, he calls up Scott Walker's office, and he's gonna pretend to be Hosni Mubarak, saying, wow, I see you're in a lot of trouble just like I was. I just want to tell you, don't step down, because I blinked. I shouldn't have. And he's thinking it would be a great, you get through. But as he calls the office, he's greeted by this very nice secretary who just somehow something about it makes him think, wow, okay, I might get through someplace here. He thought he was just going to leave a message or something like that. And so suddenly he thinks, I don't know if I can maintain a Hosni Mubarak accent for, however long I'm talking to somebody. So he thinks, who can I be? I got it. David Koch, the billionaire funder of right-wing campaigns. And so suddenly he says, yeah, this is David Koch. And the secretaries keep going, David Koch, the billionaire? Yep, I want to talk to my friend Scott Walker. So he keeps working his way through secretaries and assistants, and suddenly, and it's tape recorded, phone clicks, hi, this is Scott Walker. And there he is, the Buffalo Beast, talking to Scott Walker. And now Scott Walker was not quite together enough to realize that the Koch brothers are from Kansas, and they have these very flat Midwestern accents. Not, if you listen to the phone call, not an accent like Tony Soprano. But conversation goes on for 20 minutes. In the midst of the conversation, the reason I tell you about this is because of this media element of it. In the midst of the conversation, the Buffalo Beast says, pretending to be the Koch brother, wow, how's the media coverage out there? And Scott Walker goes, it's been that good. Fox is good, of course, but, some of it's a little shaky. But there was a front page article in the New York Times the other day that was really good. I liked it so much because it was all about how private sector workers don't support public sector workers. I had it photocopied and distributed to every member of the legislature. See, this is where the thing starts to fall apart. And a lot of other things fell apart as regards media coverage and political response as well. Initially there was an assumption that those who were protesting just couldn't be anything but affected parties, that nobody would ever show any solidarity beyond themselves. And I thought, how could the New York Times, which got that story of Janesville so wrong, how could they have gotten it right? What could they have done? And then it occurred to me, they could have stayed in Madison rather than drive down to Janesville and walked around the Capitol and seen hundreds of members from United Auto Workers Local 90 in Janesville who were there every day with their banners marching in solidarity with the public sector workers. You didn't have to go find that. They were there. The solidarity was there, but so much of our media doesn't even know how to cover it, doesn't even want to get it in their head. And this became sort of the pathology of a lot of what happened and what continued to happen. Finally, Governor Walker and his allies decided they were going to break apart the budget bill so that the Democratic senators who had fled to another state would not be relevant, that they could pass it as a non-budget bill. Now, if you can imagine this, they took legislation involving union representation, wages, benefits, and pensions and declared it to be a non-economic bill. And they passed it. Now, on the day that they passed it, Governor quickly signed it. They violated open meetings laws. Do you realize that to this day, the Wisconsin law is still in play in the courts with lawsuits? It's an amazing sort of ongoing struggle. But the day after the governor signed it, the New York Times had another headline. Many of the broadcast outlets had a headline or broadcast. They said, Wisconsin's struggle is over. Governor prevails. Unions are defeated. And this was on a Friday. And I thought to myself, darn, I thought something really amazing was happening here. Sort of like, a mass movement, kind of maybe not Egypt, but, influenced thereby. And maybe Jesse Jackson had come and said, this is the new civil rights movement, labor rights or human rights. And I'm thinking, real things were happening here. And now the New York Times has told me that the struggle is over. And I was quite bummed out. But I thought, some of my farmer friends were going to come in the next day, that Saturday. And I thought to myself, well, what the heck? I'll go down south of town and to the parking lot where they're all going to gather with their tractors and see what's going on. Because you realize that the New York Times is not delivered to farms until several days later. So they did not know that the struggle was over. So I go down south of town to this parking lot, and there are dozens and dozens of tractors. Now, if I was a courageous person, I would have said to the farmers, hey, guys and gals, the struggle is over. The New York Times has reported that the unions have been defeated. The governor said, and you know that when somebody official does something, right? When a president or a governor or a mayor does something, that's the end of social protest. That's the end of political activity beyond that because, all power rests with the powerful. And so there can't be any sort of people power challenge to it. So once the New York Times says it's over, it's over. And I could have said that to him, but, I didn't have the guts to do it because one farmer had done his chores from midnight to 3 a.m. and had driven his tractor from Cobb, Wisconsin, 7 hours in the snow because tractors don't go very fast. And I thought, I just didn't have the guts to tell him that he had wasted his time because the struggle was over. So, and my daughter was with me and she wanted to ride on a tractor. So my friend Joel Greeno from up in northwest Wisconsin, an old kind of, farm labor solidarity guy with deep roots in all these movements, finally pulled his hat on, Peterbilt hat, and, gave the call, let's roll. And all these tractors started rolling out of this parking lot toward the Capitol because the farmers had come to the rescue. And we go up and, farmers, tractors do move slowly. So it took us about, 5 minutes, 10 minutes to get to the first corner. And at the first corner, there were 3 little kids. And they had made a sign with their hands that said, thank you, farmers. And I thought, well, this is wonderful, It's really, really sweet. And somebody forgot to tell the kids that the struggle is over. And so we kept rolling along. We go to the next corner. And again, it takes about 10 minutes more. And at the next corner, there's about 100 people out. And they have a big banner that they've unfurled that says, farmers and workers pull together, solidarity. And I thought to myself, wow, this is really sad. Because, here I've been waiting all my life to see, farmers and workers and everybody pulling together, doing this stuff. And, of course, we've been defeated. The New York Times says the struggle is over. And then we kind of rounded the turn. We started heading up this big, long road toward the center of town. And suddenly I see police sirens. And or police lights coming. And they roll up, right next to the farmers on the tractors. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm in so much trouble with my wife. I took my kid to a farm protest and now we're going to get arrested. But no, this was Wisconsin, where the police and firefighters were on the side of the union struggle, and they hadn't come to arrest us. They had come to block each street so the farmers could roll to the Capitol. And as we rolled along, I'm thinking, wow, this is amazing. Even the police are on our side. And then I thought, uh-oh, big trouble. Because here come the SUVs. And the SUVs do not like tractors. It's a natural hatred, very normal when you think about it. SUVs go fast on country roads. Tractors go slow. So I'm thinking, and I said to my daughter, shield your eyes, daughter, from the one-fingered signal of disapproval as the windows rolled down. But it wasn't the one-fingered symbol of disapproval. It was actually hands creeping out in this cold, snowy day from these SUVs and forming the clenched fist symbol of solidarity, and also happens to be pretty much the shape of Wisconsin. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, this is amazing. Farmers and SUVs together. And Wisconsinites are not the brightest people in the world, but over a period of time, we had even learned how to honk the slogan, "This is what democracy looks like," on our horns. Beep, 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 beep. And the SUVs were honking, and the fists were out in the air, and the police lights were flashing, and the farmers were waving their fists in solidarity, and we're heading toward the Capitol. I thought, this is the saddest day of my life. Because, if I had just told the farmers, we wouldn't be in this embarrassing situation that, here we are rolling toward the Capitol, but the struggle is over. We've been defeated. The governor has signed the bill. And I'm so sad. And there's the lights and beep, 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 and the fists and the farmers. And we pop over the curb, kind of entering into the great square around the capital of Wisconsin. And we are greeted by 180,000 people who do not read the New York Times. And if there is one fundamental reality from the Wisconsin story, which is an ongoing story to this day, and which has extended into Ohio and into Michigan and into places across this country, and which has seen a relationship with, and I'm not one of those people who say that Wisconsin anticipated Occupy Wall Street and that they are the same thing. They are different in many, many ways. And yet, there's a relationship there. And all of these struggles that are going on, so much of the history that is playing out as we speak. But if there is one thing that comes back from the Wisconsin struggle that is absolutely vital, it is that power will write the obituary of every movement that ever tries to stand up for workers in this country. It always has, and it always will. It will tell you that you've been defeated. It races to the point where it can say, this struggle is over. And the wonderful thing about what has happened in Wisconsin, what continues to take place in Wisconsin, and also in other states across this country, is a refusal to accept it. Every time the movement in Wisconsin has been declared dead, it has pushed the coffin lid up, dug itself out of the grave, and fought back. And I want to tell you that this is the remarkable part. I wanted to tell a story, and that's why I wrote a book about this building of a movement. I didn't want to just focus on electoral politics, but I will tell you that the book closes off with a lot of Democratic Party leaders and union folks saying, I just don't think it's going to be possible to remove Scott Walker as governor of Wisconsin. We know he's very unpopular, but it takes so many signatures to petition for the removal of a sitting governor in America. 25% of the electorate in the last election, that's 540,000 people in a small state have to sign petitions to recall Scott Walker. It's an impossible thing. You can't force an elected leader out just because he's offended against the rights of labor, against the civil service, against local democracy, against all the things we value. That is just not a doable thing. But there's a little group called United Wisconsin. Somebody put a website up and they said, if you want to get rid of Scott Walker, you had to wait a year. By law, you couldn't do it immediately. You had to wait a year to petition for the recall of Scott Walker. So if you want to do this, give us your name and address, and email, and we'll contact you when the right time comes. Well, 200,000 people signed up. And the guy who put the website up said, I don't know anything about politics. I don't know anything. I just put a website up. And he said, he emailed people. He said, if you think you're smart and together and you're an honest person, let me know. Send me an email. And so he got these emails, and he actually interviewed people to be the board of United Wisconsin. And he said, here's the deal. You don't get paid anything. You don't get, there's no glory in this. This is a grassroots movement. But if you will do this, I will give you the 200,000 names. Now, if you know anything about politics, 200,000 names of people that want to do something is something every politician wants. But this guy said, I'm not giving it to any politician. So he got a small business owner. He got a guy who was a firefighter. He got a guy who was like a clerk. All these ordinary folks who were just smart. And he said, build a movement. So they created this thing called United Wisconsin. And they said, the Democratic Party was very resistant, very uncomfortable. They said, on November 17th, we're going to start petitioning to recall Scott Walker. And they trained ultimately 30,000 people to go out and collect signatures. And they're going to do it through the midwinter, through Christmas, through New Year's, at a time that's just terrible time in which to do this. Everybody said, it's the worst time of the year to do it. And yet, when I went, on Black Friday, the most horrible day of the year, day after Thanksgiving, when, you've had this wonderful moment with your family, and now you have to get up at like 3 a.m. to go and shop for stuff. In every mall in Wisconsin, when you pulled into the parking lot at 3 a.m, there was a United Wisconsin volunteer saying, before you go and shop for stuff, help us to get our state back. And they petitioned through Christmas, through New Year's. And again, people said that's very difficult, but I actually think it probably kept a lot of marriages together. People said, honey, I got to go out and do some petitioning. And so people kept doing it, and yet it was still written off to the end, constantly the obituary written until January 17th of this year, just recent, few weeks ago. A van pulled up outside the Government Accountability Board in Madison, Wisconsin, and they popped the back of the van open, and people started grabbing boxes and running them through a gauntlet of firefighters. They had all the bagpipers out. They had bagpipers are everywhere. And they started running this gauntlet with these boxes. 1 box, 2 box, 10 boxes, 20 boxes, 50 boxes, 100 boxes, 1,000 boxes. They kept running through the afternoon, taking it in, piling it up. And when they finally did the accounting, the United Wisconsin movement, a grassroots movement with only 1 employee, with only 1 person working for it, grassroots movement of 30,000 volunteers, had filed more than 1 million signatures to recall and remove Scott Walker from office. But it doesn't stop there. They filed 850,000 to recall his lieutenant governor from office. And then they filed another 100,000 to recall the leadership of the state legislature from office. And the incredible thing about it, and I'll close off with this story, because really everything that's happened in Wisconsin, and by extension, I read a lot about this in the book, what we've seen in Ohio, where they overturned their anti-labor law, what we've seen developing in other states across the country. But the incredible thing about it is a woman named Lori Compass. And Lori Compass is a wedding photographer. And she lived in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. And when she contacted the United Wisconsin folks and the Democratic Party folks and said, I'm represented by Scott Fitzgerald, the leader of the state Senate, one of the most powerful people in Wisconsin politics. He should be recalled too. He's the one who violated the open meetings laws. He's the one who broke all these rules. He's the one who pushed this thing through. We really have to remove him from office. She was told, no, your district is is perhaps the most Republican district in the state. It's a very, very conservative place. There's not going to be any support for this. You're just a naive dreamer who doesn't know anything about politics. And so Lori Compass sat down at her kitchen table, and she created a website called recallfits.org. And she said, and she created a Facebook page. She said, if you want to help me out, I want to get rid of the most powerful person in the Wisconsin state legislature. And she started going out with her own petitions, hand-printed initially. And on that day that the signatures were filed against the governor, against the lieutenant governor, there marching with bagpipers all around her was Lori Compass and all of her volunteers who had gathered 21,000 signatures to recall Scott Fitzgerald. And I think sometime in the coming week, Lori Compass will announce as the challenger to Scott Fitzgerald for his seat. Now, as you can tell, I could keep telling you stories forever. But the bottom line is, the reason I wanted to write this book was about people like Lori Compass. It was about grassroots folks who've gone out and done fundamental things to change our politics, and about the faith that underpins that, a faith that in this American democracy, we have rights outlined in our Constitution, including the right to assemble and to petition for the redress of grievances. And we have rights outlined by the progressive movements of a century ago to recall and remove officials who offend against the basic premises of that democracy, and to put referendums on the ballot to overturn laws that are inappropriate. And the story of Wisconsin is a story of using those rights and a story of taking back our founding premises as well as our legal structures from a Tea Party movement that has so misinterpreted and in many cases lied about the basic premises of this American experiment. What has happened in Wisconsin is that people have stood up and said that we will use all the tools available on Election Day, on an every day in between, because the great Wisconsin progressive Robert M. La Follette was right. Democracy doesn't end on Election Day. Democracy begins on Election Day. Democracy is a life. People in Wisconsin have begun to live that life fully. People in Ohio have begun to live that life fully. People in Michigan are standing up to start to organize there. In Indiana, where they're going to push back against a right-to-work law. In Arizona, where just this last week they stopped a major attempt to take down the rights of labor unions. And across this country with the Occupy Wall Street movement that is not merely objecting to austerity, but that is beginning to outline a vision of an economically and socially just America where we do not have the constant threat of austerity, but we have the promise of accountability, of a taxation on those who have taken so much from us and a redistribution of that wealth to the great mass of people so that never again does a child go uneducated, does a child go hungry, does a community go unserved because a billionaire doesn't have enough. This is the new politics of protest in America, and it is the most hopeful political development of my lifetime. Thank you very much for coming out.